I love Queens. It is home to great diversity, great food, and of course, the best train in the system. While it is a great borough to live in, there are a few questionable things about it, and one of them is how everything is organized, the street grid. The Queens street grid makes absolutely no sense. Major roads curve at the weirdest angles. There are mini-series of streets that contradict other mini-series of streets. And finally, there are major slashes that cut right through the centers of neighborhoods. So in this video, we will talk about why the street grid is so weird in Queens. Some of the meandering streets were part of Native American trails. For example, Jamaica Avenue used to be the old Rockaway Trail. Northern Boulevard was originally another major trail. Those trails were major arteries of Native American trade. Eventually, the Dutch started settling around the trails. By 1645, the Dutch established Vlissingen, a small town in northern Queens. You may know that settlement as Flushing. At first, relations between the Native Americans were good. However, the relationship quickly soured, and in 1656, Thomas Hicks led a group to drive out Native Americans. The events that followed were known as the Battle of Madman's Neck, in which Native Americans were forced out of their land. Those trails were later renamed, and development grew around the trails. New streets began to radiate from these old trails. Some of the original trails were then widened, like Northern Boulevard. All of this contributes to the meandering nature of the Queens street grid. When some streets were already meandering, and the street grid was built around those trails, expect the surrounding street grid to contradict a bit. The next one is a bit more obvious, the railroads. Queens was the hotbed of different railroads in the 1860s and 70s. We got the LIRR itself in 1836, the New York and Flushing Railroad in 1854, the South Side Railroad in 1867, and the Central Railroad of Long Island in 1873. But because Queens was farmland back then, the railroads would build tracks however they saw fit. However, when Conrad Pappenhausen bought out all the railroads in 1876 and unified them under the LIRR, the many competing lines were closed to save money. However, for one reason or another, part of their right-of-way was preserved. Here are some notable examples. In the far end of southeastern Queens, the street grid looks okay. Well, except for a large slash. What was it? That was the former Cedar Hurst Cutoff, the LIRR's response to the South Side Railroad. In 1869, the South Side Railroad opened a branch to Far Rockaway, which proved to be successful. So the LIRR opened the Cedar Hurst Cutoff in 1872 to compete with the South Side Railroad. But by 1876, when the LIRR was unified, the Cedar Hurst Cutoff was redundant and was axed in 1877. However, Rockaway ridership was strong, so the Cedar Hurst Cutoff was reactivated in 1905. But for some reason, it never saw passenger trains, and was only used for routing equipment. The rails were torn up in 1918, but when development was slowly marching towards the area in the 1920s, the LIRR wanted to protect their right-of-way. So once again, they relayed tracks there. But then they were deemed redundant, and were permanently axed in 1934. This is why there is a giant slash through the street grid, as that was the former Cedar Hurst Cutoff. In northeastern Queens, the street grid follows no real patterns. Major streets were curved, and the entire street grid would bend to their will. Then you have a giant park, the Casino Corridor Park, in the very center of northeastern Queens, forcing all major streets to go around it. So, what is going on here? Well, a partial reason for this is because there used to be a railroad here, namely the Central Railroad of Long Island. The Casino Corridor Park rests on the old right-of-way. The effect on the street grid gets more pronounced as you go east, as just like the Cedar Hurst Cutoff, there seems to be a slash right through the street grid, as that was where the old railroad used to go. Well, this wouldn't be a JTA video without me mentioning the Rockaway Beach branch. Speaking of which, a quick side tangent, the City Council is currently accepting testimonies about the EIS of Queenslink. If you want to make your thoughts known that a Queenslink is the right project and not a Walmart Highline, click on the link below. Anyway, back to our discussion. I still do think that this is appropriate given the branch slices through the center of Queens, which contributes to the insanity of the street grid. Because of this railroad, there are a ton of crescents in Rego Park. To the south, streets are being broken up by the branch. And also, you have this parking lot. Well, this wasn't always a parking lot, but rather a former ramp for Atlantic trains to merge onto the Rockaway Beach branch. There are other railroads that developed the Queens street grid, but if I continue to ramble on, we will be here all day. So let's move on to the next topic, Arbitrage Rock. This is related to the southern portion of Queens, and if you watch my video on the Brooklyn-Queens border, you would know that the border is extremely jagged and weird. That is thanks in part to Arbitrage Rock. Back when Queens was mostly an English town, while Brooklyn was mostly a Dutch town, there were disputes of where the border actually was. So to reach a solution, the settlers agreed to draw the border from a random boulder called Arbitrage Rock. While this worked for a bit, this created a problem when development in both towns grew. The border cut through people's homes, and because Brooklyn and Queens weren't unified yet, it created a problem of people not knowing whom they owed taxes to and who was their representative. So a commission was set up to redraw the border, but not as a straight line. They would try to mimic the old border set up by Arbitrage Rock, which is why the southern border of Queens is jagged and weird looking. Before Queens became the Queens we know today in 1898, Queens itself was a number of smaller towns and villages. For example, you had Newtown in the west, Flushing in the northeast, and Jamaica in the southeast. There were other neighborhoods before Queens became a New York City borough, but that became Nassau County in 1899. But anyway, these towns not only had their own street grids, but also, even the street grids of the communities inside those towns were mostly disconnected from one another. For example, within Newtown, I counted 8 distinct street grids. Eventually, when a new street grid was designed, it incorporated the old street grids of Queens. This made for some weird combinations, especially with the street numbers. In certain areas, there would be a massive jump in street numbers. For example, in Astoria, the street grid jumps from 49th Street to 70th Street as a result of 2 different street grids colliding. One from Astoria, which was formerly known as Hallett's Cove, and the other from Jackson Heights in Elmhurst. Another aspect of how insane the Queens street grid is how many times the numbers repeat. For example, on the east-west axis, there is 60th Avenue, 60th Road, 60th Drive, and 60th Court. On the north-south axis, there is 60th Street, 60th Place, and 60th Lane. What is going on here? Wouldn't it be much more helpful to make the numbers more consistent, like 60th Street, 61st Street, than 62nd Street? Well, there is a reason for this. In this case, out of 60th Avenue, 60th Road, 60th Drive, and 60th Court, only 60th Avenue was the originally intended street. The others were add-ons. But why? Well, Queens might have been a little too popular after the subways reached here, and the need for new streets to access new developments rose. This is why there is 60th Road, 60th Drive, and 60th Court. And there is a pattern to this. For streets, it is place, then lane. For avenues, it is road, then drive, then court. Finally, the subways had a major effect on the street grid in 2 ways. The first way is obvious. Where the subways went was where the streets were. The Flushing line went through farmland, and a space that it ran over became Queens Boulevard and Roosevelt Avenue. Both of these streets used to be separate paths before they were joined together by the 7 train. Later, in 1933, the Queens Boulevard line further reinforced this unification of different paths by widening Queens Boulevard, thus making it the main thoroughfare of Queens. The second way is that the subways brought a level of growth that created the other changes on this list, something that the LIRR never achieved. If you look at the maps prior to the subways, there were the LIRR lines. And while the LIRR spurred development, all the development was limited to the existing stations. In between the stations was nothing. That was understandable if you knew how commuter rail operates. They run at a way lower frequency, thus making it less convenient for workers to get to work. Plus, Penn Station wasn't a thing until 1910, which meant people had to get off at Long Island City, hop onto a boat, get off, and take a series of elevated lines to get to work, further constraining convenience. But the subways promised frequent and direct service to Manhattan, which finally made Queens an attractive place to live. So, when the then called Corona Line opened in 1917, development followed, and within a few months, the line was already running at capacity. But this growth was the reason why the individual street grids expanded so much that they clashed with each other. They were the reason why street numbers even existed in the first place, and why street numbers repeat thanks to the new developments and streets added to the grid. And they were a reason why the certain meandering streets became the backbone of Queens, like Queens Boulevard. All in all, the Queens street grid is extremely weird. However, when you look at the history, it is clear as to why. Queens used to consist of different towns with their own street grids. When it came time to stitch them together, you create something that is extremely weird. Other factors like the railroads and subways created a huge level of growth, thus accelerating the process of how these street grids looked. The railroads had a major effect on streets being routed, as the railroads would spur development, and it was much easier to build streets along the railroad tracks. Finally, old Native American trails had a major effect, which is why certain streets looked really weird. Anyway, this marks the end of this video. What are your thoughts on the Queens street grid? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.